The year was 1968, and Harlem was burning, not with fire, but with ambition, desperation, and the intoxicating promise of the American dream twisted into something darker. In the heart of this chaos stood Frank Lucas, a man who would become both hero and villain in the mythology of the streets, a figure so audacious that reality and legend would forever blur around him. Frank Lucas arrived in Harlem from North Carolina with nothing but the clothes on his back and a hunger that couldn't be satisfied by honest work. He watched, learned, and waited. When Bumpy Johnson, the legendary crime boss who had ruled Harlem with an iron fist wrapped in velvet, died in 1968, Lucas saw not a tragedy, but an opportunity. While others mourned, he calculated. While others wondered who would fill the vacuum, he was already filling it. What made Lucas different wasn't just his ruthlessness. Harlem had plenty of ruthless men. It was his vision. He looked at the heroin trade and saw inefficiency, middlemen taking cuts, diluting product, inflating prices. The Italian mafia controlled the supply chain, and everyone paid tribute. Everyone except Frank Lucas, who was about to rewrite the rules entirely. Lucas crafted an image carefully. He wore tailored suits, drove expensive cars, and carried himself with the bearing of a legitimate businessman. He attended boxing matches, was photographed with celebrities, and created an aura of invincibility. But beneath the sophistication was a man willing to do whatever it took to build his empire. Then came the story that would define him forever, the coffin story. According to Lucas himself, he had found the ultimate smuggling route, the bodies of dead American soldiers returning from Vietnam. In interviews years later, sitting in prison with nothing left to lose but his legend, Lucas claimed he had used the coffins of fallen servicemen to smuggle pure heroin directly from Southeast Asia into the United States. The Blue Magic, as his product became known, was 100% pure, undiluted by the countless hands it never passed through. The claim was monstrous, unpatriotic, and utterly unforgettable. It painted Lucas as a man without boundaries, someone who would desecrate the sacred to build his fortune. America recoiled in horror. Here was a criminal who hadn't just broken the law, he had violated something fundamental about American values, using the ultimate symbol of sacrifice for profit. The story exploded across newspapers and eventually into Hollywood. It became the centerpiece of his legend, the detail that separated him from every other drug dealer. Whether completely true or embellished, the coffin narrative served Lucas's purposes perfectly. It made him larger than life, transformed him from a criminal into a mythological figure. Years later, investigators and journalists would question the details. Some said it never happened, others said it happened differently. But by then, it didn't matter. Frank Lucas had understood something profound. In America, the story you tell about yourself can be more powerful than the truth. He had built an empire on heroin, but he had built a legacy on legend. The man who came from nothing had created something that would outlive him, a myth wrapped in a mystery, delivered in a coffin. In the misty highlands where Burma, Laos, and Thailand converged, there existed a place that mapmakers called the Golden Triangle, but which should have been named something far more sinister. This remote mountainous region had cultivated opium poppies for centuries, but it took the chaos of the Vietnam War to transform it into the world's heroin factory, a place where geopolitics, warfare, and narcotics became so entangled that they could never be separated again. The story begins not with criminals, but with the Central Intelligence Agency and the tangled web of Cold War politics. As America committed itself deeper into Vietnam throughout the 1960s, it needed allies, any allies. In the highlands of Laos, the CIA found the Hmong people, fierce mountain fighters willing to wage a secret war against communist forces. But the Hmong had another crop besides rice, opium poppies that had sustained their economy for generations. The CIA, focused solely on fighting communism, made a devil's bargain. They provided Air America, their airline front, to transport Hmong commanders and supplies throughout the region. those same commanders were deeply involved in the opium trade. Whether through willful blindness or active complicity, American aircraft became part of the infrastructure that moved raw opium from remote villages to processing facilities. The war created the perfect cover. Who would inspect military cargo in a war zone? As the war intensified, so did production. The Golden Triangle's output skyrocketed from roughly 70 tons of opium per year in the early 1960s to over 1,000 tons by 1971. Chemists, some Chinese, some French-trained Corsicans fleeing Algeria, set up laboratories in the jungle, transforming raw opium into heroin hydrochloride, the pure white powder that would flood American streets. The military logistics network became a smuggler's paradise. Thousands of American soldiers cycled through Southeast Asia, and with them came an unprecedented infrastructure. Cargo planes, shipping containers, military postal services, and most significantly, the bodies of fallen soldiers being returned home. The sheer volume of material moving between Southeast Asia and the United States was staggering. Thousands of flights, millions of pounds of cargo, and, tragically, tens of thousands of flag-draped coffins. This massive flow created gaps that enterprising criminals could exploit. Inspections were inconsistent. Military shipments received less scrutiny than civilian ones. The assumption was that no one would dare use military channels for smuggling, especially not the sacred transport of fallen heroes. That assumption was catastrophically wrong. The war also created demand. American soldiers, traumatized by jungle warfare and the constant proximity to death, turned to heroin in alarming numbers. By 1971, estimates suggested that 15% of American servicemen in Vietnam were addicted to heroin. They had discovered that Southeast Asian heroin was incredibly pure, incredibly cheap, and incredibly accessible. When these soldiers returned home, many brought their addictions with them, creating a ready market. The Vietnamese conflict became more than a war. It was an incubator for the modern heroin trade. It established supply chains, corrupted officials, created addicts, and demonstrated that vast quantities of drugs could be moved internationally under the cover of legitimate operations. The Golden Triangle's heroin laboratories worked around the clock, and the chaos of war ensured that no one was watching too closely. Frank Lucas would later claim he simply recognized what was already happening and inserted himself into the flow. Whether innovator or opportunist, he understood that war had created the perfect conditions for his empire. A supply unlimited, a logistics network unmatched, and a government too distracted by geopolitics to notice the poison flooding home. The story seems too Hollywood to be true. Heroin hidden inside the coffins of dead American soldiers, their final journey home desecrated by packets of white powder tucked beneath their flag-draped remains. Frank Lucas told this story with such conviction that it became gospel, repeated in courtrooms, documentaries, and eventually immortalized in Ridley Scott's film American Gangster. But what actually happened? The answer, like most truths involving Frank Lucas, lives somewhere in the shadowy space between fact and mythology. Lucas's own account varied depending on who was listening and when he was telling it. In some versions, he described traveling to Bangkok personally, meeting with Thai generals and Chinese suppliers, arranging for heroin to be packed directly into the coffins with bodies. He spoke of having contacts, corrupt officials, sympathetic servicemen, who would facilitate this unholy arrangement. The drugs would arrive at military bases stateside, where Confederates would retrieve them before the coffins reached grieving families. It was brilliant, monstrous, and, according to Lucas, absolutely true. Richie Roberts, the detective who eventually brought Lucas down, heard these claims firsthand during interrogations. Roberts, a man known for his integrity in a notoriously corrupt police force, remained skeptical. Frank told a lot of stories, Roberts would later reflect. Some were true, some were true-ish, and some were Frank being Frank. When pressed on the coffin story specifically, Roberts acknowledged that Lucas definitely smuggled heroin from Southeast Asia, definitely had military connections, but the coffin detail? That remained unproven. The Drug Administration investigated these claims extensively. Their files reveal a more nuanced picture. Yes, Lucas had established a direct connection to suppliers in the Golden Triangle, bypassing the traditional mafia-controlled French connection. Yes, he had secured remarkably pure heroin that he branded Blue Magic. And yes, there were suspicious shipments connected to military transport. But actual evidence of drugs inside coffins with bodies? The investigators found none. What they did find was more mundane but equally effective. Military cargo containers, footlockers belonging to servicemen, furniture shipments for returning officers, all presented opportunities. Some evidence suggested heroin was hidden in compartments of military vehicles being shipped back. Other testimony indicated drugs traveled in cargo planes carrying coffins, but not inside them. The distinction mattered legally and morally, but from a smuggling perspective, it was semantic. The military logistics network was the vehicle. The specific hiding place was just detail. Leslie Ike Atkinson, one of Lucas's alleged partners who actually served in Vietnam, told a different story entirely. Atkinson, a sergeant who understood military operations intimately, claimed he was the real architect of the smuggling operation. According to Ike, they used military mail, personal belongings of servicemen, and yes, cargo shipments that accompanied coffins, but never the coffins themselves. That would be stupid, Atkinson said. Too risky, too obvious if discovered, too disrespectful even for us. The truth may be that Lucas conflated different smuggling methods into one spectacular narrative. Perhaps drugs traveled on the same planes as coffins. Perhaps they were packed near coffins in cargo holds. Perhaps corrupt mortuary workers had access to shipments. Each step removed from the sensational claim, but each step closer to what investigators believed actually happened. Why would Lucas embellish? Because the coffin story served multiple purposes. It demonstrated his ruthlessness, elevated him above ordinary criminals, and created a legend that ensured his name would never be forgotten. In the economy of criminal mythology, that story was worth more than any amount of heroin. Decades later, the question remains unanswered definitively. No coffin was ever opened to reveal heroin. No witness testified under oath to placing drugs inside. But somewhere in the fog of war, in the chaos of Southeast Asia, Frank Lucas built an empire. Whether in coffins or merely beside them hardly matters to the families destroyed by Blue Magic. There are crimes against property, crimes against persons, and then there are crimes against the soul of a nation. What Frank Lucas allegedly did, or what America believed he did, fell into that final category. The image of heroin hidden in coffins bearing fallen soldiers wasn't just shocking, it was a violation of something sacred, a desecration that struck at the very heart of the social contract between a country and those who die for it. When the story broke, the reaction was visceral. Veterans groups erupted in outrage. Gold Star mothers, women who had already sacrificed their sons to the jungles of Vietnam, now had to contemplate an additional horror, that their children's final journey home might have been exploited by drug traffickers. The thought was unbearable. These young men had died in service to their country, and their bodies, the vessels that families would bury, mourn over, and visit for generations, might have been used as drug mules. The symbolism cut deeper because of the war itself. Vietnam was already tearing America apart. By the early 1970s, protests filled the streets, trust in government had collapsed, and the nation was bitterly divided over whether the war was noble sacrifice or tragic mistake. Into this wound, the Lucas story poured salt. It suggested that even death in service couldn't be sacred, that even the military, the institution that promised to honor its fallen, had been corrupted and exploited. But the real destruction wasn't symbolic. It was happening in real time on the streets of Harlem and in black communities across America. Blue Magic, Lucas's ultra-pure heroin, hit the streets like nothing before it. Previous heroin was typically diluted to perhaps 5 or 10% purity by the time it reached users. Lucas's product arrived at 70 to 90% pure, and he sold it cheaper than the competition. The result was catastrophic. In Harlem, where poverty and limited opportunity had always made escape tempting, heroin became an epidemic. Young men and women who might have become teachers, artists, or entrepreneurs instead became addicts. The drug didn't discriminate. It took jazz musicians and day laborers, high school students and Korean War veterans. Families disintegrated. Children grew up with absent or zombified parents. Crime exploded as addicts stole to feed habits that cost more each day. The cruelty was compounded by who was profiting. Frank Lucas was black, from the same community he was destroying. He walked the same streets, attended the same clubs, knew the same people. He wasn't some distant, faceless cartel. He was a neighbor growing rich while his community died. Some saw him as a Robin Hood figure. He gave to churches, helped families in need, employed locals. But the mathematics were clear. Whatever charity he provided was infinitesimal compared to the destruction his product caused. The heroin epidemic transformed neighborhoods. Parks became shooting galleries. Apartment buildings became shooting galleries. Young women turned to prostitution to support their habits. Young men robbed their own families. Emergency rooms filled with overdose victims. Some saved, many not. The pure heroin that was Lucas's competitive advantage also made it deadlier. Users accustomed to diluted product would inject their normal dose of blue magic and simply stop breathing. For the families of soldiers, the betrayal operated on multiple levels. Their sons had gone to Vietnam, some willingly, some drafted, to fight what their government called a necessary war. They died in rice paddies and jungles, thousands of miles from home. The promise was that they would return with honor, that their sacrifice would mean something. Instead, according to the legend, their bodies became tools in a scheme that would addict and kill thousands more Americans, the very people they had died supposedly protecting. This wasn't just crime, it was a profound moral failure that indicted everyone. The military that allowed its logistics to be compromised, the CIA that had facilitated the Golden Triangle's expansion, the politicians who had sent young men to die in an unwinnable war, and, most visibly, Frank Lucas, who had looked at death and suffering and seen only opportunity. The coffin story, true or exaggerated, became a perfect metaphor for the entire Vietnam era. Good intentions corrupted, sacrifice exploited, and death commodified. In Harlem, mothers buried sons who never went to war but died anyway, casualties of a different kind of invasion, one that came home in cargo holds and spread through their streets like a plague. The war had come home indeed, just not in the way anyone expected. In 2007, nearly 3 decades after Frank Lucas's empire crumbled, he was reborn, not in flesh, but in celluloid, transformed by Ridley Scott's camera and Denzel Washington's charisma into something larger, more romantic, and far more palatable than the man who had flooded Harlem with poison. American Gangster wasn't just a movie, it was the final, most successful act of Frank Lucas's career, the complete transformation of a drug dealer into an American legend. The film opens with Lucas as a loyal driver to Bumpy Johnson, witnessing his mentor's death and then seizing opportunity with entrepreneurial brilliance. We watch Denzel's Lucas travel to Thailand, negotiate with generals, and, yes, pack heroin into the coffins of dead soldiers. The scene is shot with artistic gravitas, somber music, respectful lighting, Lucas himself looking conflicted but determined. The film doesn't glorify the act, but it does mythologize it, treating it as an undeniable fact rather than an unproven claim. What follows is a masterclass in sympathetic portrayal. Lucas is shown as a family man who loves his mother, a community figure who helps neighbors, a businessman operating by a code of honor. His primary antagonist isn't the drugs destroying his community, it's the corrupt police and the Italian mafia trying to maintain their monopoly. Russell Crowe's Richie Roberts becomes not just a detective, but Lucas's moral mirror and eventual friend. By the film's end, Lucas has served his time, helped bring down corrupt cops, and walks into the sunset having paid his debt to society. The real story was considerably less cinematic. Frank Lucas wasn't Bumpy Johnson's trusted lieutenant. He was a mid-level operator who inflated his connection to the legendary boss. His trip to Thailand, while possibly true, lacked witnesses and documentation. The coffin smuggling, as we've explored, remains unproven. His cooperation with authorities, which the film portrays as principled, was actually a desperate attempt to reduce a 70-year sentence. He named names, destroyed lives, and walked free while others served his time. Most significantly, the film barely addresses the devastation Lucas caused. We see glimpses of addicts, but they're background decoration in Lucas's story. The thousands of people whose lives were destroyed, the families torn apart, the children who grew up without parents, they're statistics, not characters. The movie gives us 2 hours with a complex, charismatic Lucas and mere minutes with his nameless victims. Richie Roberts, who consulted on the film, later expressed ambivalence about how it turned out. "They made Frank into Denzel," he said in one interview. "Everybody loves Denzel, but Frank wasn't Denzel. Frank was a drug dealer who hurt a lot of people." Yet Roberts, too, had become part of the mythology. His friendship with Lucas post-incarceration presented as evidence of redemption rather than what it might actually have been, a complicated relationship between hunter and hunted. The film's success created a feedback loop. Suddenly, Lucas's version of events became the accepted version because it was the version millions had seen. Young people who knew nothing about 1970s Harlem now knew about Frank Lucas, except they knew the Hollywood version, where he was practically Robin Hood with a heroin habit to supply. The film spawned documentaries, books, and countless articles, each referencing the movie as if it were historical documentation. Lucas himself, elderly but still sharp, embraced his new celebrity. He gave interviews, appeared at screenings, signed autographs. He had always understood the power of myth-making, and now Hollywood had given him the ultimate myth, redemption. The man who had destroyed communities was now a cautionary tale, a complex figure, an example of both American entrepreneurship and American justice. He had successfully laundered his reputation as thoroughly as he had once laundered his money. But where does fact end and legend begin? Perhaps the question itself is wrong. Perhaps Frank Lucas understood something profound about American culture. We don't remember facts, we remember stories. The truth about his smuggling methods, the actual body count of his product, the real extent of his empire, these are knowable things, documented in court records and DEA files. But they're boring compared to the legend. The coffin story, true or not, is unforgettable. The image of Denzel Washington negotiating in Thailand is more powerful than any police report. The narrative of the outsider who beat the system, got caught, cooperated, and survived is more satisfying than the reality of a drug dealer who simply got lucky, got caught, and snitched to save himself. In the end, Frank Lucas achieved something remarkable. He made people forget the poison and remember only the legend. American Gangster didn't just tell his story, it completed his transformation from criminal to cultural icon. Somewhere in Harlem, in the graveyards where his victims are buried, the truth remains. But in the American imagination, Frank Lucas is immortal, not as he was, but as he always wanted to be seen. The man who beat the system, the gangster who became a legend, the myth that swallowed the truth whole and never looked back. The coffins, whether they carried heroin or just cargo, delivered something far more lasting than drugs. They delivered a story that America couldn't resist believing.